Welcome to our deep dive into Auguste Comte, the mind behind positivism.
Yeah, positivism. It's fascinating, isn't it? A movement so central to the 19th century, but kind of faded in the 20th.
Precisely. Though with neo-positivism and all that, it wasn't a clean break, was it?
Not at all. It morphed, took on new forms. But I think for you, coming from philosophy, the core of Comte's work really stands out. He was arguably the first philosopher of science as we understand it today.
You're right. His approach to the philosophy of science was systematic. Mathematics, physics, chemistry, biology, he tackled them all. And that early focus on the social aspects of science, that's still hugely relevant.
Absolutely. It's funny, though, his philosophy of science, it gets all the attention. But his political philosophy, that's a whole other story.
And quite a different one from the classical theories.
Completely.
We should probably mention his big three, right? The course on positive philosophy, that's the foundation.
From 1830 to 1842.
Yeah. And then the system of positive polity, that's where things get a bit, well,
Controversial.
to put it mildly. From philosophy, he jumps right into religion of humanity territory.
Oh, and let's not forget the early writings. Those really show how his thinking evolved all the way back to the 1820s.
You know, it's interesting how people talk about a good Comte and a bad Comte, usually based on that course. But when you look at it all together, it's more complex than that.
I agree. There's this drive, this movement from the scientific rigor of the course to almost a religious zeal in the system.
And it's not just theoretical musings. I mean, before World War I, positivism was a global phenomenon.
Global, yeah. Think of Brazil, Ordem e Progresso, right on their flag, straight from Comte.
And the Young Turks, too. Modern Turkey, secularization, Comte's influences there. England, the U.S., India, positivism resonated everywhere.
It really did. And for philosophers, it's fascinating how it kind of went quiet after World War I.
Neo-positivism taking over.
Yeah, that's right. But then we get to the post-positivist era. And what happens? They rediscover Comte's original ideas. That social context of science, the importance of justifications, all there in what they call paleo-positivism.
It shows you how ideas can be buried, then resurface. It's like intellectual archaeology. But you know, that word positivism, it meant something quite different for Comte back in the 19th century.
Different, how so?
It wasn't just about the philosophy of science, it was about politics. Positivism was a political philosophy, first and foremost. Science was the tool, the means to reorganize society.
And this comes through in his work from 1822, right? The plan for the scientific work necessary to reorganize society.
Precisely. It wasn't just about understanding the world, but about actively changing it.
And his thinking kept developing, too. Later on, he really stressed the continuous dominance of the heart. Remember his famous motto, love as principle, order as basis, progress as end.
It's a far cry from the cold, detached image of science some people have. But this evolution, doesn't it create some problems when trying to understand Comte as a whole?
Problems.
Well, is there a single thread running through his work? Or is there a sharp break between the early scientific focus and the later, more religious phase?
That's a big question.
It is. And then there's his relationship with Saint-Simon. Was Comte just building on Saint-Simon's work? Or did that connection actually hold him back?
Yeah, those are the two big issues, I think.
They really are. So to get to the bottom of this, I thought we could start with his early life. Comte was born in 1798, bright kid, got into the École Polytechnique. That's got to be significant, right, for a future philosopher of science, being immersed in that kind of environment.
Absolutely. That was the breeding ground for scientific minds in France. Not unlike Hegel's time at the Evangelische Stift in Tübingen, places that shaped generations of thinkers. Comte got a top-notch scientific education, and that definitely instilled in him the importance of empirical observation and rigorous systematic analysis. But it's also crucial to remember the wider context. He was coming of age in the wake of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era, a time of tremendous upheaval.
Right, so how do you build a stable society when the old foundations, religion, monarchy, are gone?
Exactly. That was the big question for Comte and his generation. How do you reorganize human life without God or king?
Makes sense why he wasn't a fan of classical political philosophy then. Those ideas of individual freedom, popular sovereignty.
Right, he saw them as great for dismantling the old system, but not for building something new.
So where does Saint Simon fit into all of this?
Well, after the Bourbons came back, they shut down the École Polytechnique. This was 1817, and Comte ended up working for Saint-Simon.
As his secretary.
Yeah, and as an intellectual collaborator. And this is where he encounters a bunch of ideas that really shaped his thinking, even though he later moved away from them. One of them was this idea of history being split into organic and critical periods. Organic is when society's harmonious, everyone believes the same things. Critical is when things fall apart. There's doubt and skepticism everywhere. The French Revolution, for Saint-Simon, that was a prime example of a critical period.
Makes sense, given what we were just talking about.
Right. And then there's this concept of industrial society rising, changing everything. It's not about military power anymore. It's about economic production, how we interact with nature. Saint-Simon even thought this would bring an end to war, which,
A bit optimistic, maybe.
maybe a bit. But for Comte, the most important idea he picked up from Saint-Simon was this notion of spiritual power.
Spiritual power.
Yeah. Saint-Simon was seeing how science was becoming more and more authoritative. But in a secular age, you still need something to hold society together.
Yeah.
So he thought, well, you need a new kind of priesthood.
Not priests in the religious sense.
No, these are the scientists, the engineers, the learned folks. They're the ones who will guide society intellectually and morally.
So it's almost like religion itself becomes a kind of applied science. I can see how this would be a stepping stone towards the system.
Totally. But Comte wasn't just absorbing these ideas passively. He was a brilliant, independent thinker. He felt Saint-Simon was a bit messy, lacked intellectual rigor.
Which led to their split, right, in 1824.
Exactly. Partly because Comte felt Saint-Simon was taking credit for ideas that were really his. There was some friction there, personal and intellectual.
And it was right after this break that Comte started developing his own unique system. In 1825, he wrote the Philosophical Considerations on the Sciences and the Scientists. That's where we first see the law of three stages and his hierarchy of sciences, the building blocks of his positivism.
Right, and shortly after that, he wrote the Considerations on Spiritual Power. There's this fascinating idea there that the natural state of the human mind isn't doubt, but dogmatism.
Dogmatism, that's an interesting thought.
It is. It connects with people like Peirce and their critique of Descartes. The idea is we don't start by doubting, we start by believing. Doubt comes later. And it's the fixation of belief that resolves doubt and allows us to act. This leads directly to Comte's ideas of positive faith, faith rooted in science and this need for a theory of belief and a theory of intellectual authority.
Then, in 1826, something interesting happens. He's building on his 1822 plan, getting ready to lay out his system, but he takes a detour.
What happened?
He realized his social science, his positive polity, they needed a stronger foundation. So he decided to review and systematize all of existing scientific knowledge. And that became the course on positive philosophy. It's funny, what became his most famous work was initially just a prelude to his bigger project.
A huge prelude, though. 6 volumes.
Oh, and 1826 was also the year of his cerebral crisis, right after he gave the first lecture of his course. Must have been a tough time for him personally.
No doubt about it. Forced him to stop teaching for a while. But it's important to remember, he was already making a name for himself in intellectual circles. People like Guizot, Lamennais, they respected him. And his lectures were drawing big names, too. Alexander von Humboldt, Fourier, even John Stuart Mill was impressed by his early work.
So let's get into the course itself. Comte is very clear in the first lesson about what he's trying to do. 2 main goals, and they're linked. First, establish sociology as a real science, give it a solid foundation. He called it social physics back then.
Putting it on par with the natural sciences.
Exactly. And the second goal was to bring all of positive knowledge together, all the different sciences, in a systematic way. That's why the course is structured the way it is. The first 3 volumes are all about the fundamental sciences, mathematics, astronomy, physics, chemistry, biology. Then the last 3 volumes are about the social sciences, particularly sociology.
So the first part is like setting the stage, and the second part is where he builds his own edifice.
That's a good way to put it. And that brings us to his most famous idea, the law of 3 stages. It's so central to his work it appears twice in the course, once as part of his theory of social progress, and once as a way of understanding how positive philosophy itself evolved.
The way we think as individuals and as a society. For Comte, those are 2 sides of the same coin.
Absolutely. So the law of the 3 stages, it says that humanity goes through these 3 stages of thought: the theological, the metaphysical, and the positive.
The theological stage, that's the earliest one. We explain things by appealing to gods, spirits, supernatural stuff. Then comes the metaphysical stage, which is like a transition. We still talk about abstract forces and stuff, but they're not personalized gods anymore. And then finally, you reach the positive stage.
Which is where Comte wants us to be.
Right. This is where we give up on trying to find the ultimate causes, the essences of things. We focus on what we can observe and on finding the laws that govern how things work. It's about replacing absolute notions with relative ones based on observation and evidence.
And he connected these stages to different types of societies, too. Theological stage is military societies. Metaphysical stage is legalistic societies. And the positive stage is industrial societies, organized around science and technology.
Fascinating how he weaves it all together.
It is. But this idea of the positive stage, it's often misunderstood. People think it means denying any kind of objective truth, being completely skeptical. But that's not what Comte was saying. Remember his idea that dogmatism is our natural state? He thought science was the most reliable way of getting at the truth.
But it's an evolving truth, right? Science is always refining itself, getting closer to a complete picture of the world, but never claiming to have the final answer.
Exactly. It's about that process of refinement, the constant progress.
That idea of science as a self-correcting process, striving for accuracy, it has echoes in Peirce's work on fallibilism. But I think for us today, this law of three stages, this grand narrative of progress, it feels a bit dated. The 20th century, with all its horrors, kind of put a damper on that kind of optimism. Even someone like Durkheim, who was hugely influenced by Comte, he felt the need to separate sociology from those grand historical claims to make it a truly rigorous science.
I see your point. Though maybe there's a way to reinterpret the law of three stages, make it relevant for us today. Comte himself said that these stages weren't always strictly sequential, right? He saw how natural philosophy reached the positive stage much earlier than, say, moral philosophy. So maybe it's more about different modes of thinking coexisting with different levels of prominence in different fields, different times.
That's an interesting take. It makes it less about a rigid historical progression and more about a complex interplay of ideas.
Exactly. So let's move on to the second pillar of Comte's positivism, his hierarchy of the sciences. This one has aged much better than the law of three stages, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. Even today, people are still grappling with how to classify the sciences. But Comte's original classification remains incredibly influential. It's like a blueprint for understanding how all these different fields of knowledge are related to each other. And it's the backbone of the course. Each volume focuses on a different science: math, astronomy, physics, chemistry, biology, and then finally sociology in that specific order. It's not arbitrary at all.
Right. He's trying to show both the unique characteristics of each science, its subject matter, its methods, its concepts, and how they all fit together.
This interconnectedness, this dependence on each other, it's all part of his grand vision.
And this is really where he establishes himself as a true philosopher of science. People had thought about science before, of course, but Comte was the first to systematically lay out a philosophy of the individual sciences and how they relate to each other within a single intellectual framework. He arranged them on what he called an encyclopedic scale. It starts with the most general and abstract mathematics and moves towards the most specific and complex sociology. Each science builds upon the one before it.
And there's a historical dimension to this hierarchy as well. It's not just about logic. It's about the order in which the sciences actually developed historically. For Comte, the more complex sciences need the tools and concepts from the more fundamental ones, but they're not reducible to them.
Right. This is him pushing back against reductionism, that idea that everything can be explained in terms of basic physics. He recognized that each science has its own domain, its own set of questions, and it needs to develop its own methods and concepts.
Which is still very much relevant today.
Definitely. Now, when it comes to Comte's philosophy of science, people tend to focus on the grand scheme, the classification. But he also had a lot to say about the nitty-gritty of how science actually works. He was very clear about distinguishing the methodology of science, the procedures, the principles from the doctrines, the actual claims and theories that science produces.
And for him, the methodology was more important, more enduring. Because scientific theories can change, they can be revised, but the principles of how you do science, those are more stable. That's the basis for progress.
Right, it's like the rules of the game versus the actual plays. The rules stay the same even as the plays change.
A good analogy.
He also had a special place for mathematics in his system. It wasn't just another science. It was the essential tool for all the other sciences, an organon, as Aristotle would have called it. Without mathematics, the other sciences couldn't advance.
And among the other natural sciences, he seemed to particularly like astronomy and biology. They represent the two extremes of the natural world, right? The vastness and regularity of the cosmos, and then the intricate workings of living organisms. Physics and chemistry are somewhere in between.
It's fascinating how he sees the connections between these fields. And he understood that the positive method, the way you do science, has to adapt to the specific science you're working with. Astronomy is all about observation, because we can't really manipulate stars and planets. Physics and chemistry rely on experiments where you control variables and test things, and biology and sociology, those are all about comparison, looking at different species, different societies to find the patterns and regularities.
That's a much more nuanced view of science than people giving credit for. And he also recognized the importance of hypotheses. You need them to guide your research, but you always have to test them, refine them, be willing to throw them out if they don't hold up.
It's that self-correction again.
Exactly. And finally, he saw this whole hierarchy of the sciences as being linked to technology. The more complex a phenomenon, the more opportunities there are to intervene, to control it. For him, human action, guided by science, was all about shaping the world to meet our needs, but within the limits set by nature's laws.
That's what he meant by, from science comes prevision, from prevision comes action. Knowledge leads to prediction. Prediction leads to the power to do things. It's a shame he never wrote that system of positive industry he was planning.
It would have been interesting to see how he developed those ideas further.
No doubt. Now, we need to talk about sociology. This wasn't just another science for Comte, it was the culmination of all the others. It sat at the top of his hierarchy, the most complex, the last to develop.
The grand synthesizer.
Exactly. Its job was to coordinate all knowledge, all human endeavors for the betterment of society.
A huge responsibility.
It was. And for Comte, the emergence of sociology was a pivotal moment in history. It meant extending the scientific method to the last frontier social phenomena. He was going against the grain here, against people who thought the human world was fundamentally different, required different methods than the natural world. He was convinced that you could study society scientifically, just like anything else.
So he's bridging the gap between natural philosophy and moral philosophy, creating a unified system of knowledge.
Exactly. And he argued that with the arrival of sociology, we can finally make a methodological shift. We move from the objective method, looking at humanity as an object in the world, to the subjective method, understanding human nature first, and using that to understand the world. He even tried to replace traditional theology with sociology. Instead of an absolute God, he focused on humanity itself, a collective being, the subject of sociological study.
Which, ironically, makes humanity the most dependent of all beings, because we rely on all the accumulated knowledge and cooperation from past generations.
Right, that dependence becomes central in the general conclusions of the course. Comte's argument is that sociology, because it takes this uniquely human perspective, is the only truly universal science. It integrates all other forms of knowledge.
So sociology isn't just one science among many, it's the queen of the sciences, the architect of knowledge.
It's important to remember, though, that Comte's vision of sociology is quite different from how it's practiced today. He saw it as almost synonymous with philosophy, a kind of super science that brought everything together. And a sociologist, for him, needed to know everything, all the sciences, especially biology. It's interesting he didn't include economics as a separate discipline, and he didn't really emphasize using math in sociology, which is very different from today.
Yeah, that's a big contrast.
He also had a very specific view on history. He didn't see it as its own separate discipline, but as the method of what he called dynamic sociology, studying how societies change over time. He even called history without names because he was more interested in the underlying patterns, the laws of development, than in individual events or people.
This is why positivism tends to see the philosophy of science and the history of science as being closely connected. To understand a science, you need to understand how it developed historically.
Right. And Comte really believed in this. He even tried to get a share in the general history of science established at the Collège de France. Mill agreed that historical context was important, but he later criticized Comte for focusing too much on the context of discovery, how discoveries are made, and not enough on the context of justification, the reasons why we believe those discoveries are true. But to be fair to Comte, he did distinguish between the doctrinal study of science, what we know now, and the historical study of science, how we got here. He focused on the doctrinal stuff in the first volumes of the course, and then he explored the historical side more in the later lessons on sociology. So in a way, he's bridging the gap between these two ways of looking at the history of science, the internal and the external.
It's all connected.
It is. Now, the course on positive philosophy really took off in Britain. The English radicals, they loved it. And one person who was particularly impressed was John Stuart Mill. He and Comte started writing to each other in 1841. Their letters, they're a goldmine for anyone interested in 19th century intellectual history.
Mill was like a fanboy at first, wasn't he?
He was. He even credited Comte with helping him break free from Bentham's utilitarianism. But then their correspondence took a turn. Mill started disagreeing with certain aspects of Comte's system. He had issues with Comte's views on biology, especially his endorsement of phrenology. And he didn't like Comte's idea of getting rid of psychology as a separate science, replacing it with ethology to study character
Hmm.
formation. And then their views on women, that became a huge point of contention. It shows how their philosophical differences were tied to their broader social and political views.
Right, their epistemology was linked to their ethics and politics. And after 1846, when Comte started moving towards the system of positive polity and his religion of humanity, Mill just completely distanced himself. He even called the system the completest system of spiritual and temporal despotism he'd ever seen.
A pretty harsh judgment.
It was. A lot of Comte's early supporters felt the same way. They just couldn't get on board with the authoritarianism and the quasi-religious stuff in his later work. But even when he was criticizing him, Mill acknowledged how brilliant Comte was, how important his attempt to create this all-encompassing philosophical system was, even if he disagreed with the direction it took. His book on Comte, published in 1865, it shows just how much of an impact Comte's ideas had on him.
And it's clear that Comte had a huge influence on Mill, even though they ended up going their separate ways. Mill's own autobiography shows how much Comte shaped his thinking.
It's a two-way street, though.
Hmm.
Mill was also instrumental in popularizing some of Comte's ideas, especially his philosophy of science, in the English-speaking world, even if he rejected the more peculiar parts of Comte's later system.
Right, he kind of curated Comte for the British audience. So after the massive undertaking of the course, Comte went back to his original mission: social reorganization. This is what led him to the system of positive polity. Even his discourse on the positive spirit from 1844 is kind of a bridge between the two. He's emphasizing the social goals of positivism, how it can replace religion as the basis for morality and politics.
This social mission was always there, driving his work.
But then something happened in the mid-1840s, something personal. His relationship with Clotilde de Vaux. It was intense, but she died in 1846. And this really changed him, changed the direction of his work.
It's remarkable how personal experiences can have such a profound impact on philosophical thinking.
It really is. After Clotilde died, Comte's positivism became what he called complete positivism. And it's all about the continuous dominance of the heart over the intellect. He even said, "We tire of thinking and even of acting. We never tire of loving."
Quite a shift in emphasis.
It is. This is where he decides that philosophy isn't enough. It needs to become religion. And this really alienated a lot of his earlier supporters. Mill, Littre. They saw it as a betrayal of his original principles, a complete departure from scientific rigor.
I can see their point. It's quite a leap from the scientific positivism of the course to a full-blown religion.
It is. But this wasn't just a simple religion of science. Comte now explicitly puts art and feeling above pure intellect. He breaks with academia, sees women and the working class as his new allies. He gives women this almost redemptive role in the positive era, although some of his specific ideas about this are a bit, well, strange, to say the least. He saw the working class as naturally positivist in a practical sense, and himself as a kind of intellectual proletarian.
An interesting self-image.
It is. So in this complete positivism, the intellect is no longer in charge. It serves the heart, but not blindly. It guides the heart, helps it understand the world and the needs of others. Science still has a role, but now it's grounded in his positive classification of the 18 internal functions of the brain. He saw this as the biological basis for why feelings are so important.
The cerebral table, he called it, distinguishing between feelings, thoughts, and actions, and arguing that feelings should be in charge.
Right, he didn't ignore the mind, he just thought its study belonged to biology as functions of the brain. And this cerebral table, it's actually the starting point for the system of positive polity. He developed different versions of it from around 1846 onwards.
This is his subjective method in action, isn't it?
Hmm.
Sociology informing and reinterpreting the findings of other sciences.
Precisely. The sociologist, with their understanding of human needs and social dynamics, they get to redefine what the brain does. Later on, in his letters on illness, he even gives the sociological definition of the brain itself. It's the organ through which the dead influence the living, emphasizing this continuity of generations.
A very Comtean idea.
It is. Now, we don't usually think of positivism as having a political program, but social and political reorganization, that was Comte's goal from the very beginning.
It was the whole point of his project.
Right. And his positive politics rested on two main ideas. First, every society needs some form of government. And second, a well-functioning society needs a distinct spiritual power, independent from the government, to provide moral guidance and social cohesion.
So a separation of church and state, but not in the traditional sense.
Exactly. And it's interesting that first principle, the need for government, it starts from a place that someone like Hayek might agree with the recognition of spontaneous order.
Spontaneous order.
Yeah, Comte talks about it in the course in the 50th lesson. It's even titled Social Statics, or Theory of Spontaneous Order of Human Society. He saw how the division of labor created this kind of natural interdependence in society. But for him, this spontaneous order wasn't enough. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't stable on its own. That's why you need government, to keep things from falling apart, to create a sense of shared purpose.
So he's recognizing the limits of spontaneous order.
He is. And on the second principle, the spiritual power, he's really going against Marx here. He didn't believe that economics was the primary driver of history. For him, it was ideas, a shared set of beliefs and values that held society together. And initially, he thought this new spiritual power would be made up of scientists and philosophers, providing a rational, scientific basis for morality and social organization. They'd be the new priests, in a sense.
It's a bold vision.
It is. And Comte's positive politics, it's often seen as authoritarian, even reactionary.
He wasn't exactly a fan of liberalism, that's for sure.
No, he wasn't. But he also had some surprisingly insightful ideas. He understood how dependent we are on the Earth, on the cosmos. He developed this sophisticated view of the Earth as a finite, interconnected system. He even talked about what we call geopolitics today, how geography shapes political power.
He was ahead of his time in some way.
He was. And this cosmic dimension, it helps explain some of his more unusual proposals. Like after 1851, he suggested dividing France into 19 self-governing regions, which seems odd for someone who's supposed to be authoritarian.
A bit of a contradiction.
But he was only talking about the temporal power of the state, the practical stuff. That's what should be local. The spiritual power, the moral and intellectual guidance, that should be centralized, universal, like the Catholic Church used to be.
A global moral authority.
Precisely. And Comte was also an early critic of colonialism. He recognized Europe's role in developing positive thought, but he condemned how European powers exploited other parts of the world. The English positivists, they were often critical of the British Empire, too. And Comte and his followers, they were interested in comparing different religions, like Christianity and Islam. His secular, scientifically guided society, it actually found a receptive audience in the Ottoman Empire. It influenced the Young Turks and even Ataturk's reforms in modern Turkey.
So his ideas had a global reach in ways he probably couldn't have imagined.
They did. Now let's talk about that religion of humanity. The full title of the system is System of Positive Polity, or Treatise on Sociology, Instituting the Religion of Humanity. So it's right there in the title. And as you can imagine, it didn't go over well. Religious people hated it, and so did secularists.
Not exactly a winning formula.
Not at all. And the details of his religion, they were pretty out there. Rituals, a calendar of saints made up of scientists and artists, all sorts of things. It just seemed bizarre to a lot of people.
But there was a deeper philosophical reason behind this turn to religion. He defined religion very broadly. It was about harmony, integration in human life, like health for the social body. And he saw religion as having two main functions: moral guidance for individuals and social unity. His religion had three parts: doctrine based on science, worship to cultivate altruism and solidarity, and moral rules derived from sociology.
So it's about taking the functions of religion and giving them a scientific basis.
Exactly. And the object of worship in this religion is humanity itself. Not individual humans, but this collective being of everyone who has contributed to human progress. It's the source of truth, the guide for morality. Comte wanted to replace God with this concept of humanity.
Which he saw as morally superior because it was based on real human achievements, not just some supernatural being. And being part of this great being of humanity, it wasn't about biology, it was about contributing to this collective project. He even said some animals could be included if they'd done enough for humanity.
A very inclusive view of humanity.
It is. And the doctrine of this religion, it's basically all of science, which, for Comte, made it more reliable than any traditional religion based on revelation or metaphysics.
A religion grounded in demonstrable knowledge.
And then there's the worship. This is where things get really interesting and maybe a little weird. He had all these elaborate rituals, both private and public, designed to strengthen social bonds and reinforce positive values. Prayers, hymns, sacraments, even a liturgical calendar based on the Catholic one.
Hence the nickname Catholicism without Christ.
To which Comte and his followers replied, Catholicism plus science. But the public worship, that was especially unique. The calendar celebrated great figures from history, scientists, artists, anyone who had contributed to human progress. It was all about cultivating this sense of belonging to this grand, great being of humanity.
A very different way of thinking about religion.
It is. But beyond all this, Comte also had a sociological theory of religion itself. He distinguished between the family, the state, and the church, or the spiritual power, each with its own function, its own relationship to space and territory. He advocated for separation of church and state, but he saw the spiritual power as being universal, global. And this connects to his ideas about centralization. He thought the spiritual power should be centralized because it deals with universal moral principles, but the temporal power, the practical stuff, that should be more localized.
Makes sense in a way.
It does. And then finally, we come to his moral doctrine. He wanted to create a system of ethics that had nothing to do with God or the supernatural. It was all based on science, on understanding human nature, and